Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
October of 1975 proved to be uncommonly cold, even for the Scottish Highlands. The wind, sweeping in from the Black Lake, did not merely whistle through the crevices of Hogwarts' ancient stone. It seemed to keen, singing a mournful song that chilled the air, even within the castle's warmest common rooms. Yet, in the circular office, located in the highest tower, silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic, soothing ticking of silver instruments. These curious contraptions, the purpose of which was known only to Albus Dumbledore himself, puffed out tiny clouds of multicolored smoke that dissipated into the air, smelling faintly of cinnamon one moment and sea breeze the next. Minerva McGonagall sat in a stiff-backed chair, her hands resting calmly in her lap, though her posture betrayed a tension akin to a violin string awaiting the bow. She usually possessed a great fondness for this room, with its atmosphere of wisdom and tranquility, and for the portraits of former headmasters and headmistresses, who were currently snoozing softly in their frames, feigning sleep. Tonight, however, promised no such peace. Albus stood by the window, peering into the darkness beyond the glass. His silhouette against the night sky appeared elongated and somewhat weary. The moon, which only occasionally peeked out from behind heavy clouds, cast silvery highlights upon his long beard and midnight blue robes. "Do you feel it, Minerva?" he asked quietly, without turning. His voice was soft, like velvet, yet it carried an undertone of anxiety that compelled the Transfiguration Professor to straighten her back even further. "If you refer to the cold, Albus, then yes. The castle has not known such an autumn for 50 years, she replied. Her voice was crisp and composed, her usual tone for the lecture hall. But here, in the semi-darkness, it sounded quieter, more intimate. "Not the temperature of the air, my dear." Dumbledore finally turned from the window and moved to his desk, sitting opposite her. The candlelight reflected in his blue eyes, though the customary twinkle was hidden somewhere deep within. "I speak of a chill of a different sort. One that penetrates not beneath one's cloak, but into the very essence of magic." He paused. "The Forbidden Forest." "It is silent." Minerva frowned. She knew the forest well. Although it was strictly out of bounds to students, the staff knew that the place teemed with life and sound, the snapping of twigs, the hooting of owls, the thunder of centaur hooves, the rustle of thestral wings. Forest was never truly quiet. "Silent?" she repeated. "The centaurs have ceased coming to the edge of the woods to observe the stars," Dumbledore continued, slowly twisting the end of his beard with his long fingers. "Hagrid reports that the unicorns have abandoned their usual glades and retreated far to the north, into the deepest thickets where even he dares not venture at night. And yesterday, Fawkes could not sing." He nodded towards the golden perch where the phoenix slept. The bird looked ruffled, his feathers gleaming dully, as if dusted with ash. "The forest is ailing, Minerva," the headmaster said, and the simple sentence fell between them, like a heavy stone. "Something has awakened there that should not be. Or perhaps someone has brought something foreign into it." something that poisons the roots and makes the very earth shudder with revulsion. I attempted to survey the boundaries with magical sight, but there is a barrier, invisible, woven from very ancient, very subtle matter. It repels human attention. Any wizard who steps in there with the intent to scout will be detected from a mile away. Minerva understood his implication before he had even finished his thought. Her heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from a familiar thrill she had felt in her younger years while working at the ministry. "You wish for me to go," she stated. It was not a question. "A human tread will be heard by the enemy," Dumbledore agreed, peering at her over the top of his half-moon spectacles. "Human magic will be felt. But a beast is part of the forest. A cat may walk where a human cannot. She may see what is hidden from the human eye, and she may hear the whisper that to us is merely the noise of the wind." He fell silent, giving her the chance to refuse. The times were growing turbulent. Rumors of a dark wizard calling himself Lord Voldemort were becoming louder, transforming from whispers in the leaky cauldron to terrifying headlines in the Daily Prophet. Disappearances, strange accidents, grim marks in the sky. And if this evil had now touched the threshold of Hogwarts, the risk was immense. Minerva stood up. The rustle of her emerald robes sounded decisive and loud in the quiet office. "The students are asleep, Albus," she said, walking to the window and looking down at the dark mass of trees surrounding the castle. From this height, the forest looked like a black sea, attempting to swallow the stone island of the school. "But if what lurks in the forest threatens them, I will go. Right now." Dumbledore nodded slowly. He did not smile, but his gaze held deep gratitude and respect. "Be careful, Minerva. Remember, in animal form, your instincts become sharper, but so too do your fears. Do not let the forest make you forget who you truly are." She gave a barely perceptible nod. She needed no reminders of the rules of being an animagus. She had studied the art for years, enduring pain and complex transformations to achieve perfect control. Minerva moved to the center of the room where there was more space. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The air in the office smelled of parchment, sherbet lemons, and the faint scent of wood smoke from the fireplace. These were the smells of the human world. A world of order and knowledge. She began to let them go. Focus. That was the key. She imagined her body not as a collection of bones and muscles, but as a flow of energy, fluid and mutable. In her mind's eye, she saw the image, a flexible spine, soft paws, sharp ears catching every rustle. The world around her shuddered. First came the sensation of a shift in scale. The ceiling of the office suddenly soared upwards, becoming impossibly distant, and the massive furniture turned into towering cliffs. The floor, which a moment ago had been merely wooden parquet, suddenly became a source of an overwhelming amount of information. She felt the vibration of Dumbledore's every step, the coolness of the varnish, the microscopic grains of dust. Her vision changed, colors dimmed, losing their vibrancy, but in their place emerged an incredible clarity. Dark corners of the room, where the human eye saw only shadows, were now for her teeming with detail. She saw a cobweb under the cabinet, a tiny crack in the table leg, the movement of air from the heat of the fire. But the most profound change was the sense of smell. Scents hit her nose in a symphony. The smell of sherbet lemons became sharp, almost chemical. To it was added the smell of ink, old paper, bird feathers, forks, candle wax, and the scent of anxiety emanating from Dumbledore. It was a sour, tense smell that a human would never have detected. A tabby cat with distinctive spectacle markings around her eyes landed softly on 4 paws. She flicked her tail, checking her balance. Her body felt light, springy, filled with energy that begged to be released in a leap. Human worries, grading 5th-year essays, duty rosters, ordering new cauldrons, receded into the background, becoming distant and unimportant. In their place, instincts awoke. Observe. Listen. Hunt. Survive. Dumbledore leaned down towards her. His face was now enormous, his eyes like 2 great lakes. "Good luck," he whispered. The cat did not answer. She gave a short, businesslike meow, turned, and padded silently towards the door, which magically creaked open just enough for her to slip through. Her mission had begun. The corridors of the castle at night were a completely different world than by day. For students, it was a place of forbidden adventure. For teachers, a place of patrol. But for a cat, it was a territory of endless possibilities and hidden paths. She ran softly, her paws touching the cold stone without a sound. Even if someone had been walking beside her, they would not have heard her presence. Torchlight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, but Minerva the cat did not fear them. She was part of the shadow herself. Descending the grand staircase, she felt a slight dizziness. The stairs were just beginning to change direction. She masterfully leaped from one flight to another, her claws extending for a moment to grip the stone before retracting back into soft pads. Suddenly, she froze. Her ears, like small radars, swiveled to the left. Sounds were drifting from around the corner of the 3rd-floor corridor. Someone was shuffling their feet and muttering. Peeves. The poltergeist floated through the air, clutching an armful of water balloons filled, judging by the smell, with stagnant water. He was clearly preparing a trap for early morning passers-by. And then, splash, and wet little breeches for the firsties. Hee, he hummed in his squeaky voice. In human form, Minerva would have stopped him immediately, deducted points, and perhaps summoned the Bloody Baron. But right now, she was a cat. She could not risk exposure. Besides, she had a more important mission than the wet trousers of first years. She pressed her belly to the floor, blending with the shadow of a suit of armor. Her eyes did not leave the poltergeist. She waited. Her patience was absolute, a trait of both Minerva the woman and Minerva the cat. Peeves floated past, so close that she felt the cold breeze from his transparent body, and the smell of old dust that always accompanied him. He did not notice her. As soon as his laughter faded in the distance, she bolted. Her body worked like a perfect machine, muscles contracting and relaxing, her tail serving as a rudder on the turns. She sped past the great hall, its doors barred, and slipped out through a small hole in the oak gates, usually used by mice. Fresh air hit her nose like a gulp of cold water. She found herself on the steps. Before her lay the school grounds, bathed in weak moonlight. The grass was silvery with frost, but her gaze was fixed, not on the beauty of the landscape, but on the dark, foreboding wall of trees in the distance. The forbidden forest waited. And from down here, at the height of a cat, it seemed even more majestic and even more dangerous. The wind carried a scent to her that made the fur on the back of her neck stand on end. It was not merely the smell of rotting leaves or damp earth. It was the scent of fear. She took a step into the wet grass, feeling the cold drops touch her pads. There was no turning back. The path to the gamekeeper's hut seemed longer than usual. In human form, Minerva covered this distance with a brisk, determined stride in a few minutes. But for a cat, the world stretched out. Every hillock became a significant obstacle, and the tall grass, which by day was merely a green carpet, had turned into a dense, wet jungle through which she had to fight. Her paws were soaked through, and it was irritating. The feline part of her nature demanded she stop immediately, sit in a dry spot, and groom her fur until it was immaculate again. Minerva had to make a mental effort to suppress this urge. Later, she told herself sternly in her professor's voice, "Hygiene can wait." She ran, keeping low to the ground, using the shadows of bushes as cover. Ahead, glowing like a beacon in the fog, were the windows of Hagrid's hut. Thick smoke billowed from the chimney, smelling of burnt oak and some kind of meaty stew. This scent was warm, domestic, and it beckoned, promising safety. Approaching the pumpkin patch, Minerva slowed her pace. The pumpkins, grown by the half-giant's careful hand, were enormous, the size of small carriages. In the moonlight, their orange sides gleamed dully, resembling giant sleeping heads. She slipped between them, feeling the roughness of their leaves catching against her whiskers. Suddenly, the heavy door of the hut creaked open, the sound ringing out in the night, silence like a gunshot. Rubeus Hagrid stepped onto the threshold. His massive figure blocked the light from the hallway, casting a long, broken shadow onto the grass. In one hand he held a lantern with a flickering candle, and in the other, his famous pink umbrella. "Quiet, Fang, quiet," he muttered, addressing the dog cowering at his feet. Fang, a huge black boarhound who usually barked at anything that moved, was acting strangely. He whined, flattening his ears against his head, and stubbornly refused to step outside, trying to hide behind his master's broad back. Minerva froze in the shadow of a colossal pumpkin, her pupils dilated, drinking in every detail of the scene. She saw Hagrid's hands trembling, not from cold, but from agitation. She heard his heart beating fast, a heavy, booming rhythm, like the strikes of a hammer. "There's nothing out there." "Yeah, daft thing." The gamekeeper soothed the dog, but there was no certainty in his voice. He raised the lantern higher, peering into the darkness towards the woods. Just wind. Just old trees creaking. But Fang did not believe him. The dog lifted his muzzle and let out a quiet, mournful howl, staring in the very direction Minerva was heading. Animals felt it better than humans. Hagrid, despite his magical blood, still thought like a man, trying to find a rational explanation. Fang simply knew. Out there, in the dark, there was something predatory. Hagrid sighed heavily, lowered the umbrella, and scratched the back of his head. Blimey. Even you're scared. And the unicorns are gone completely. Not a trace for 3 days now. What is happening, eh? He took a step forward, and the lantern light swept across the pumpkins. The beam caught the tabby cat, sitting motionless as a statue in the darkness. Her eyes flashed with green fire in the reflected light. "Oh!" Hagrid started, nearly dropping the lantern. "Blimey. Ye gave me a fright." He squinted, trying to make out the visitor. Here, Kitty. Kitty? Who's a yeah? Mrs. Norris. Nah, she's skinny as a rake. Must belong to 1O, the first years. Yay, shouldn't be out here. Little one. It's dangerous. Hagrid made an attempt to approach. Here, Kitty, come, here. I've got a bit, sausage. And it was a temptation. Minerva, the cat's stomach, contracted treacherously at the mention of food, and instinct suggested that near the giant it was warm and safe. But Minerva, the woman, remembered her duty. She let out a low, warning hiss, arched her back, and, turning sharply, darted away from the hut, straight towards the black wall of trees. Oi! Stop! Yeah! Can't go in there! Hagrid shouted after her. She heard the heavy thud of his boots, but he was too slow. In seconds, she had crossed the boundary of light and dived into the tall, dry grass at the forest edge. The gamekeeper's shouts faded behind her. Now, before her was only him, the forbidden forest. The transition was instantaneous and overwhelming. As soon as she crossed the invisible line of the first trees, the world changed. The sounds of the open space, the whistling wind, the distant lapping of the lake waves vanished as if someone had slammed a heavy door. In their place, silence descended. But this was not the peaceful silence of a library. It was a silence that pressed on the ears, the silence of a held breath. The gigantic trunks of oaks and pines soared upwards, their crowns weaving together so tightly that moonlight barely penetrated. Here, eternal gloom reigned. For a human eye, it would have been pitch darkness in which one could easily break a neck. But for Minerva, the world took on new shades. Thanks to the tapetum lucidum, the layer behind the retina of a cat's eye, even the faintest scraps of light were amplified manifold. The forest appeared before her in monochrome, all shades of grey, silver, and deep black. She saw roots bulging from the earth like the veins of an old giant. She saw cobwebs stretched between thorn bushes, on which dewdrops froze like pearls. She stepped onto the soft carpet of fallen leaves and needles, and immediately she sensed what Dumbledore had spoken of, the smell. It was faint, barely perceptible, but to her sensitive nose it was unbearable. The forest smelled not of life, but of stagnation. Usually, it smelled of damp earth, mushrooms, resin, animal musk. Now, mingled with these aromas, was a sweet, sickly stench of decay, like the smell of stagnant water in a vase of dead flowers. And something else, the smell of metal. Cold, rusty metal. Minerva stopped, lifting a front paw. The fur on her neck stood up not from the cold, but from instinctive horror. Something in this forest was wrong. She listened. Her ears swiveled in different directions, scanning the space. Somewhere to the right, the rustle of a field mouse. Familiar, safe. Above, the sleepy stirring of an owl. Also normal. But to the left, from the depths of the thicket, came sounds that did not fit the picture. It was a strange, rhythmic sound. Slap, slap, slap. As if something wet and heavy was dragging itself along the ground, and accompanied by a quiet, barely audible humming that made her whiskers vibrate. It was not an animal. No animal moved with such unnatural evenness. Minerva felt two natures battling within her. The cat wanted to flee, to hide in the highest tree and wait out the danger. The human understood. This was exactly what she was looking for. She pressed herself lower to the ground, almost touching the moss with her belly, and crept towards the sound. Her movements became fluid, slow. She placed her paws with the caution of a sapper, checking that no twig would snap. The deeper she went, the thicker the fog became. It crept along the ground in milky tendrils, cold and sticky to the touch. Strange. Fog usually rises from water or damp earth in the morning. It was night, and the ground was dry. This fog was of magical origin. Suddenly, she stopped before a small clearing. What she saw made her freeze in place. In the middle of the clearing grew an old, twisted elm. But it looked wrong. Its bark pulsed. Black liquid, like tar, oozed from cracks in the wood. It dripped onto the ground. Slap. Slap. And where it touched the grass, the plants instantly turned black and crumbled into dust. But the most terrifying thing was not the tree. Around the elm, forming a perfect circle, lay dead birds. They had no visible wounds. They had simply fallen from the branches, as if their life had been sucked out in an instant. Minerva felt a cold fury rising within her. This was dark magic. Crude, cruel necromancy, ravaging life for some twisted purpose. She took a step forward to get a closer look, and in that moment, the wind changed. It blew at her back, carrying her scent straight to the tree. The black liquid on the trunk froze. And then slowly, unnaturally, it flowed upwards, forming something resembling a giant eye. It knew she was there. The black eye on the elm trunk did not blink. It was liquid, shifting, but the gaze it projected was entirely real and cold, like the touch of a dementor. Minerva felt her feline heart skip a beat, then hammer at a breakneck speed, echoing with a dull thud in her temples. This was not just dark magic. This was sentient magic. The tree groaned. The sound was like the creaking of old ropes on a gallows. One of the lower branches, dry and dead in appearance, suddenly lashed the air with terrifying speed. It was not the movement of a plant, but the strike of a cobra. Reflexes saved her. Her body acted faster than thought. Minerva sprang vertically upwards, flying a good 5 feet, and the black, sticky tendril flew beneath her, washing her belly with cold and the smell of rot. Landing on all 4 paws, she wasted no time. She burst into motion, turning into a striped streak of lightning. She raced through the undergrowth, heedless of the path. She no longer cared about noise. Behind her came the cracking of breaking wood and a wet squelching. The elm's roots must have been trying to tear themselves from the earth to pursue the intruder. But the tree's stationary nature played into her hands. She was faster. She was more mobile. Running 100 yards, she flew up the trunk of an old pine, digging her claws into the thick bark. She scrambled up higher to the safety of the canopy, where the air was cleaner. Only when she reached a thick horizontal branch hidden in dense needles did she allow herself to stop. Her sides heaved with heavy breathing. The small lungs of a cat were working at their limit. She pressed herself against the bark, trying to merge with the tree, and froze. The forest fell silent again. The pursuit had ceased as suddenly as it had begun, but now this silence was even more ominous. It was a silence of waiting. Calming down a little, Minerva began to analyze what she had seen. Her human mind, hidden within the feline skull, worked clearly. The elm was not the source of the evil, but rather a sentry. Someone had turned a living tree into a trap, into an alarm system. This meant that whoever had done this wanted to protect something that lay further, deeper in the thicket. She peered cautiously from her hiding place. From this height, she had a view of a small gap between the trees. The moon briefly emerged from behind the clouds, illuminating a strange path crossing the forest floor. Minerva narrowed her eyes. Footprints. She saw centaur tracks, deep hoofprints. She saw the light tracks of foxes. But what she noticed now belonged to none of these creatures. These were spots, scorched patches on the ground, glowing with a faint, barely visible violet light that was quickly fading. They were spaced a stride apart. Someone had walked here very recently. Someone whose boots were soaked in a magical substance so potent it scorched the very earth beneath their feet. She had to verify. It was madness. Instinct screamed to stay in the tree. But curiosity and duty prevailed. Minerva began to descend. She moved headfirst, spiraling around the trunk to constantly monitor the surrounding space. Touching the ground, she smelled a strange odor coming from the footprints. It was familiar. She racked her memory, scrolling through thousands of scents she knew as a potions master, though it wasn't her primary subject. Every Hogwarts teacher knew the basics. Sulfur, wormwood, and salamander blood. These were ingredients for rituals of elemental fire. Very unstable, very dark fire. She approached one of the tracks. The grass in it was not merely burnt, it had turned to glassy ash. It was a human footprint. The shoe size was small, perhaps male, but refined. And then she realized the most terrifying thing. The tracks did not lead in one direction. They stopped. The last footprint was right in front of her. And there was no next one. This could mean only two things. Either the wizard had disapparated, which was impossible within Hogwarts grounds, but who knew what barriers had been broken? Or he had taken flight, or he had stopped. Right here. Cold horror rolled down her spine, raising the fur along her entire backbone. She felt a gaze upon her, not the magical gaze of the tree eye, but the attentive, studying gaze of living eyes. Minerva slowly, very slowly turned her head. 10 paces away, in the dense shadow of an old oak, stood a figure. It had been there the whole time. It stood so motionless that even feline vision did not immediately pick it out from the gloom. It was wrapped in a cloak that shimmered with the colors of bark and leaves. Perfect camouflage. The face was hidden by a deep hood. But Minerva saw the hands. Pale. Long fingers clutched a wand, which was pointed not at her, but slightly to the side, as if the stranger had not yet decided if this cat was worth the attention. Hominum revelio, whispered a voice. It was dry, raspy, like the rustling of dry leaves. The spell hit like a wave of invisible heat. It passed through Minerva. She knew what it meant. This spell revealed the presence of humans. If she lost concentration for even a moment, if her Animagus form wavered even slightly, if her human consciousness betrayed itself with a human mental response, she was dead. She had to be a cat, 100%. She had to think of mice, of milk, of a warm spot by the fire. She banished all thoughts of Dumbledore, of the school, of danger. I am a cat. I am a beast. I hunt. I fear. The wave of magic subsided. The hooded figure took a step forward. The stranger's boot stepped on a dry branch. and the sound seemed like an explosion. The stranger muttered. Just an animal. The forest is full of eyes tonight. He lowered his wand but did not put it away. But even animals can be witnesses, he added more quietly. He raised his wand again. The tip glowed with green light. Minerva realized this was the end of the game of hide and seek. She tensed her muscles, preparing for the leap of her life. Her secret was on the verge of exposure. And now, in the heart of the forbidden forest, far from help, she was left alone with the shadow that had come to destroy her world. The forest around them froze, as if awaiting the first flash of the curse. A green flash sliced through the darkness of the forest, soundless and blinding. It was a light that cast no shadows, a light that carried within it absolute finality. But the cat was faster. A split second before the killing curse broke from the tip of the wand, Minerva pushed off the soft earth with her hind legs with a force that seemed impossible for such a small animal. She leaped aside, into the saving thicket of ferns. The beam of the curse, whistling a mere millimeter from her ear, struck an old stump behind her. The wood exploded in a cloud of splinters, but did not catch fire. It simply turned grey in an instant and crumbled, as if it had rotted away 100 years in a single second. "Reducto," barked the wizard, sending another curse in her wake. The ground to Minerva's right flew into the air in a fountain of dirt and stone. The shockwave caught her tiny body and threw her into the brambles. Sharp thorns dug into the tender skin beneath her fur, but she made no sound. The pain was distant, dulled by adrenaline. Right now, there existed only instinct. Run. She did not attempt to fight. In cat form, she was defenseless against magic of this level, and transforming into a human would take precious seconds, during which she would become a perfect target. Her only weapons now were darkness and speed. She dived under the tangled roots of an upended beech, slipped through a narrow burrow left by a badger, and burst out on the other side of the ravine. She ran in zigzags, chaotically changing direction to throw off the enemy's aim. Behind her came the cracking of branches and furious cursing. "Where are you? You little vermin!" Incendio. The forest behind her erupted in flames. Minerva felt a wave of heat lick at her tail. She flattened her ears and accelerated, stretching her body into a taut string. She raced through the undergrowth, leaping over fallen trunks, tearing through thorny bushes that clawed at her like living fingers. Gradually, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. The dark wizard, whoever he was, did not risk venturing too deep into the forest. Or perhaps he had lost her trail in this chaos of shadows. But Minerva did not stop. She ran until her heart began to beat in her throat and her lungs burned with fire. Only when the familiar smell of burning was left far behind, and the damp forest silence reigned around her once more, did she allow herself to slow down. She scurried into a small clearing covered in silvery moss and collapsed onto her belly. Breathing heavily, her sides heaved, and a small pink tongue lolled out, trying to cool her overheated body. She was safe, for now, but it was a deceptive safety. Minerva lifted her head and looked around, This part of the Forbidden Forest was unfamiliar to her. The trees here were taller and older than those growing near the edge. Their crowns wove together so tightly that not even moonlight penetrated here. Eternal twilight reigned, filled with a strange, bluish glow, the source of which was the fungi growing on the trunks. Suddenly, the ground beneath her paws shuddered. It was a rhythmic, heavy vibration. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was approaching. Someone large and four-legged was coming her way. Minerva instantly tensed, preparing to flee again, but a familiar scent stopped her. The smell of wild sage, horse sweat, and smoldering tobacco. Centaurs. A majestic figure emerged from the darkness. It was Bane, a black-haired centaur with a wild, severe face and a powerful torso. In his hands, he held a bow, an arrow already nocked on the string. Beside him walked Ronan, calmer, with a red beard and sorrowful eyes. They stopped a few paces from the cat. Bane frowned, looking down at the small tabby animal sitting on the moss, staring at him unblinkingly. "Mars is burning bright tonight," his voice boomed, deep as an echo in a cave. "And the forest is restless. Even the smallest creatures flee the fire." Ronan sighed, looking up at the sky, which was invisible behind the canopy. The innocent are always the first to suffer. Bane. It is in the nature of things. He lowered his gaze to Minerva. There was no surprise in the centaur's eyes, only a deep, almost human understanding. "Greetings," he said quietly. "You have strayed far from your stone nest, daughter of two worlds." Minerva tensed. She knew that centaurs possessed the gift of seers and saw more than they spoke. Daughter of two worlds, human and beast, or teacher and warrior? She made a short, questioning sound, something between a meow and a purr. Bane snorted and struck the ground with his hoof. "Do not pretend you do not understand," he said sharply. "We see what hides beneath the skin. You seek the source of the poison." Minerva nodded her feline head slowly. It was a risky gesture, but she had to show that she understood them. "It is there." Bane waved his hand, holding the bow towards where all the darkness of the forest seemed to flow. "Where the old stones sleep beneath the roots, where the water turns black." "We do not go there," Ronan added, and fear rang in his voice. "The stars say that an ancient grievance has awakened there. Someone has disturbed what should have slept forever. And this someone brought a cub with them." A cub. The word struck Minerva like a whip. So her guess was correct. A student in the forest. And he was alive, but captive. "You cannot stop this alone," Bane continued, looking down at her haughtily. "Fate is already written in the heavens. What is to happen will happen, but the stars only point the way." "Bane," Ronan objected gently, "they do not force us to walk it. Perhaps this guest can change the current of the river." Bane merely gave a contemptuous snort and turned to leave. "Come, Ronan. The forest belongs to predators tonight. We have no place here." The centaurs moved away, dissolving into the fog as quickly as they had appeared. But before disappearing completely, Ronan turned back for a moment. "Beware of that which grows but does not live," he whispered. "And remember, the cat walks by herself, but even she sometimes needs the help of the pride." Minerva was left alone, but now she had a direction. Where the old stones sleep beneath the roots. She knew what they were speaking of. Deep in the Hogwarts archives, She had seen references to old druidic ruins that existed here long before Godric Gryffindor laid the first stone of the castle. She shook off the remnants of fear, stretched, loosening her muscles, and headed in the direction Bane had indicated. Her steps became more cautious. The forest around her was changing. If before it had been merely gloomy, now it was becoming hostile. The air thickened, becoming viscous as jelly. Breathing was becoming harder, but the worst was the sound. To the usual forest noise was added a low, vibrating hum that was felt not by the ears, but by the bones. It was magic deforming space. Minerva walked forward, and every step was an act of will. She was a guardian. She was a protector. And somewhere out there, in the darkness, waited a student who had no one else to help him. The centaur's words, "Where the water turns black," rang in Minerva's head like a warning bell as she made her way through the increasingly dense thickets. The territory she had stepped onto was unfamiliar to her, and this troubled her perhaps most of all. She, the deputy headmistress, who knew every secret passage in the castle and every path in the grounds, now felt like a stranger in her own home. The forest here had changed. The trees stood so close that their trunks rubbed against each other, emitting a long, groaning sound with every gust of wind. The ground beneath her paws became soft, boggy, and unpleasantly warm, as if it were rotting from the inside. The smell of decay intensified, becoming thick and oily. It settled on her tongue with the taste of rust. Suddenly, the ground dropped sharply away. Minerva skidded to a halt, unsheathing her claws to keep from sliding down the slope. Before her, at the bottom of a deep ravine, flowed a river. But this was not the cheerful, clear water that fed the Black Lake. It was a stream of black, thick substance resembling molten tar. It flowed slowly, soundlessly, lazily skirting stones which, upon contact, became covered in slippery, bruise-colored moss. No coolness radiated from the river. On the contrary, a suffocating steam rose from it. Minerva flattened her ears. She needed to cross this stream. Stones protruded from the liquid, forming a precarious bridge, but instinct screamed, "Do not touch the water." She took a deep breath, calculated the trajectory, and jumped. The first stone was slippery. Her paws nearly splayed, but she kept her balance with her tail. Second jump, successful. Third, she was already in the middle of the stream when the surface of the water began to boil. It was not fish. From the black sludge emerged thin, knobbly limbs, resembling roots, but with claws at the ends. Bowtruckles. Usually, these small tree guardians were shy creatures, no larger than a hand, who fed on insects and protected their homes. But these were different. They were larger. Their skin, which usually resembled bark or twigs, was black and glistening, and their eyes burned with the red fire of madness. Dark magic had twisted them, turning peaceful sentries into an aggressive swarm. There were dozens of them. They rained down from overhanging branches, climbed out of the water, scrambled onto the stones, blocking the path. One of them, the size of a large rat, lunged at Minerva, trying to latch onto her muzzle with its sharp, needle-like fingers. She reacted instantly. A swipe of her paw with claws extended knocked the attacker into the water, where it vanished with a loud splash. But 3 new ones took its place. They were surrounding her. Minerva hissed, arching her back. The situation was critical. She stood on a slippery stone in the middle of a poisonous river, surrounded by enemies she could not defeat with simple physical strength. There were too many of them. In human form, a single wave of her wand would have been enough to scatter them with an impedimenta jinx. But she was a cat. She could not pronounce the incantation. However, she was not just a cat. She was a master of transfiguration. As another wave of corrupted bowtruckles surged towards her, Minerva concentrated all her will. She did not transform into a human on the slippery stone. That would be suicide. She would simply fall into the water. Instead, she turned to a higher form of Animagus magic, partial projection. She imagined her desire for defense taking physical form. In the moment she raised a front paw to strike, it was no longer just a cat's paw. The air around her vibrated, and the fallen leaves, swirling above the water, suddenly changed their structure. They hardened, sharpened, and gleamed with a metallic luster. For a split second, a vortex of steel blades, transfigured leaves, formed around Minerva. She swept her paw, controlling this whirlwind, not with a wand, but with pure intent. Swish, swish, swish. The blade swept around her, slicing through the attackers like a scythe through grass. The bowtruckles fell into the water with high-pitched squeaks. The path was clear. Wasting not a moment, Minerva made a final, desperate leap. She flew a good 7 feet over the black water and landed on the opposite bank, digging her claws into a pine root protruding from the earth. The steel leaves, losing their magical sustenance, turned back into ordinary, dry, brittle foliage and fell quietly into the stream. Minerva scrambled up to the plateau and looked back. The creatures in the water were raging, but dared not venture onto dry land, far from the source of the dark power. She had won this round. A tremor ran through her body, recoil from using wandless magic in beast form. It required colossal effort, but there was no time to rest. Ahead, through the wall of trees, a weak, pulsing light was breaking through. She moved towards it, treading softly as a ghost. Now the forest changed again. The trees here did not grow chaotically. They formed an avenue. Ancient, dead trunks covered in white lichen stood like columns in a ruined temple. And at the end of this avenue lay the ruins. This was what the legends spoke of, and what few believed in. The remains of an ancient druidic sanctuary. A ring of enormous standing stones, menhirs, most of which had toppled and overgrown with moss. But the central stone stood, and between them the air trembled with tension. Minerva crawled closer, hiding behind a fallen trunk. From here, she had a view of the center of the sanctuary. There, in the center of the stone circle, a fire burned. But the fire was not orange, but pale violet. It gave no warmth, only a cold, corpse-like light. By the fire stood the same cloaked figure. The hood was thrown back, but the wizard's face was hidden by a silver mask, smooth, featureless, with only slits for eyes. A Death Eater, or someone else. The wizard was monotonously chanting an incantation in a language that sounded like stones grinding together. He held his wand over a stone altar, and on the altar lay a boy. Minerva's heart clenched. This was not just an abstract student. She recognized him by his messy hair and the scarf trailing on the ground. It was David Gordon, A Gryffindor, first year. A quiet, shy boy who was forever losing his quill and was afraid of his own shadow. He lay motionless, his eyes closed. Above his chest hung a sphere of darkness that pulsed in time with the wizard's words. With every beat of this pulsation, David's face became paler, as if life was draining from him, flowing into the stone beneath him. Sanguis vitae terra antiqua, blood of life, ancient earth, drifted to Minerva's ears. The wizard was trying to awaken a source of power, using the child as a battery. If the ritual completed, the boy would die, and the forest would turn into a domain of darkness that would consume Hogwarts. Minerva assessed the situation. She was alone. The wizard was strong. Around the altar, there were likely protective wards. A direct attack in human form was a duel in which she had a disadvantageous position, as she had to protect the unconscious student. But she had an advantage the wizard did not know of. He thought the forest was empty, save for him and his victim. He did not expect that behind his back sat the most dangerous predator in Scotland, a furious Scottish wildcat who also happened to be the most powerful witch of her generation. Minerva began to circle, looking for a gap in the defenses. She noticed that the violet fire reacted to the wizard's movements. The magic was unstable, and then she saw it. Perched on one of the menhirs, directly above the wizard's head, sat a raven. It did not move. Its eyes glinted glassily. It was not a real bird. It was a totem, the focus of the ritual, holding the energy within the circle. If she could knock it down, the circle would break. Minerva pressed her hind legs into the ground, checking her traction. It was a high climb to the top of the menhir, but the stone was rough, perfect for claws. She had one chance. One jump. One mistake, and David would die. She exhaled, emptying the air from her lungs to become lighter, and began her silent run. Climbing the menhir demanded all of Minerva's concentration. The stone was ancient, covered in centuries of lichen layering which turned to slippery mush under her paws. But beneath the lichen, the granite was rough and cold as ice. She ascended vertically, driving her claws into microscopic cracks, moving in bursts, synchronizing her movements with the rhythmic shouts of the wizard below. Vitae terra antiqua sanguis. Every syllable of his incantation was accompanied by a flare of violet flame, and in those moments, the shadow of the menhir became thick and impenetrable, allowing Minerva to remain unseen. She was a shadow within a shadow. Reaching the top, she saw the totem up close. It was not simply a stuffed raven. The bird was carved from obsidian, and in its eyes burned real rubies, pulsing in time with the heartbeat of the boy on the altar. Thin, barely visible threads of magical energy stretched from the statuette straight to David's chest. It was an anchor. If destroyed, the energy the wizard had so painstakingly gathered would break free. It would be an explosion. But a controlled explosion was better than the slow death of a child. Below, the wizard raised his wand for the final chord. Consummatum est. It is finished, he cried, and the sphere of darkness began to descend onto the boy's chest. Now, Minerva bunched her muscles and struck. She didn't just push the statuette, she threw the entire weight of her body and all the fury accumulated within her into the motion. The blow of her paw landed squarely on the side of the obsidian bird. The statuette was torn from its place, flew a short arc, and with a loud, glassy shatter, smashed against the stone floor of the sanctuary, right at the wizard's feet. The effect was instantaneous. The thread of energy snapped with a deafening crack, like the crack of a whip. The violet fire, deprived of its focus, roared and shot upwards in a pillar of frenzied flame. The sphere of darkness above the boy burst, dissipating into black smoke. "No!" screamed the wizard, recoiling and shielding his face with his arm from the heat. "What have you done?" He looked up at the menhir and saw her. A tabby cat stood on the edge of the stone, her fur ruffled by the wind of the magical storm, her eyes burning with martial zeal. But this time she did not flee. Minerva leaped down, but in mid-flight something happened that the wizard clearly did not expect. The contours of her body blurred. Elongated, fur turned into the heavy fabric of emerald robes. Paws became hands firmly gripping a wand that appeared out of nowhere. It was not a cat that landed on the ground. Before the altar, shielding the unconscious student, stood Professor McGonagall. Her face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, and in her eyes burned a cold fire more terrifying than any curse. "Protego horribilis," she cried, slashing her wand through the air. A powerful, translucent shield sprang up around her and the boy, deflecting waves of chaotic magic that flew from the shattered altar. Stones around them cracked, old trees at the edge of the clearing caught fire, but inside her dome, it was quiet. The wizard in the mask recovered quickly. He understood that his ritual was ruined, but he also saw who was before him. "McGonagall," he hissed. His voice sounded distorted through the mask, but it carried malice mixed with fear. "You always stick your long nose where it doesn't belong. Step away from the boy." Her voice was steely, even with no hint of breathlessness after the transformation. "And surrender. The Aurors are already on their way." It was a bluff. She had summoned no one, and no one knew where she was. But the wizard hesitated. He looked back at the shattered totem, at the dying fire, at the resolute figure of the witch. He was strong, but a battle with Minerva McGonagall on her territory, and Hogwarts and its environs were her territory, was a risk he was not prepared to take. "This is not the end," he spat. "The forest remembers. And we remember." He swept his cloak sharply. Fumos. Thick black smoke exploded from his robes, filling the space around them. Minerva instantly sent a powerful blast of wind in response. Ventus, dispersing the smoke in a second, but the clearing was already empty. The wizard had vanished, likely used a prearranged portkey, or fled under the cover of smoke into the thicket. Minerva did not pursue. Her priority lay on the cold stone of the altar. She lowered her wand but did not stow it, and bent over David. The boy was pale as chalk. His chest barely rose. She touched his forehead. It was icy. The ritual hadn't killed him, but it had drained much of his strength. "Enervate," she murmured softly. The boy's eyelashes fluttered. He took a deep, convulsive breath, as if surfacing from underwater, and opened his eyes. They were unfocused, full of terror, cold. He whispered, "Mum, it's so cold." "It is all right, Mr. Gordon." Minerva's voice changed instantly. The steely notes of the warrior vanished, replaced by the soft, soothing intonation of a teacher. She removed her outer cloak and wrapped the boy in it. "You are safe. I am here." David tried to sit up, but had no strength. He looked fearfully at the dark trees. There was a man. in a mask. He said scary words. He is gone. I chased him away. Minerva straightened and surveyed the clearing. The ritual fire had died, leaving behind only a pile of ash and the unpleasant smell of sulfur. The forest plunged back into darkness. But now it was ordinary night darkness, without that suffocating, artificial weight she had felt earlier. The trees seemed to sigh with relief. But they were still far from the castle, deep in the forbidden forest, with an exhausted child in her arms. And although the main enemy had fled, the forest still teemed with dangers awakened by the dark magic. "Can you walk, David?" she asked, though she knew the answer. The boy shook his head, his teeth chattering. "My legs. I can't feel my legs, Professor." Minerva nodded. She had expected this. "Very well. Hold on tight." She waved her wand, transfiguring a pile of branches into a comfortable stretcher that hovered in the air. With levitation charms, she transferred the boy onto it. "Lumos Maxima," she pronounced. A ball of warm, bright light broke from her wand and hung above them, illuminating the path. The light drove the shadows back into the thicket. "We are going home," she said firmly, "and may Merlin help anyone who tries to stop us." She moved forward, leading the stretcher behind her. Ahead lay a long journey through the night forest, which was slowly waking up after the magical shock. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled, or perhaps werewolves. Minerva McGonagall gripped her wand tighter. The night was not over yet. The sphere of light, conjured by the Lumos Maxima spell, drifted through the ancient thickets like a small, lonely star that had fallen from the sky and was now trying to find its way back to the firmament. Darkness swirled around it, thick, almost tangible to the touch, pressing against the boundaries of the circle of light, like a predatory beast that fears the fire but is loath to relinquish its prey. Minerva McGonagall walked ahead, holding her wand high. Her steps were measured and firm, though every muscle in her body screamed for rest. The magical stretcher bearing David Gordon floated in her wake, tethered by an invisible magical rope. It moved smoothly, navigating around protruding roots and low-hanging branches, so as not to disturb the exhausted boy. The forest had changed. If on the way in it had been tense and hostile, now, after the destruction of the dark ritual, it seemed confused. The trees creaked differently. It was a sound of pain, as if nature were trying to heal a wound inflicted by dark magic. The air still smelled of ozone and burning, but cutting through this stench was the familiar, soothing aroma of damp pine needles and decaying leaves. "Professor," David's quiet voice broke the silence. It sounded weak, barely audible over the rustle of their footsteps. Minerva stopped immediately and turned. The boy lay looking into the darkness with wide eyes. He was shivering, and this tremor was transmitted even through the thick fabric of her cloak in which she had wrapped him. "I am here, Mr. Gordon." She approached the stretcher and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her palm was warm, and this simple gesture seemed to work better than any calming draught. "How are you feeling?" "I'm cold," he whispered, his teeth chattering, "and I think I've lost my wand." Minerva smiled faintly. Only a Gryffindor could worry about a lost wand at a time when his life had been hanging by a thread. "The wand will be found, or we shall select a new one for you," she reassured him. As for the cold, she made a complex movement with her wand, as if scooping up the air. Caloris aeris. A wave of warm air enveloped the stretcher, creating the effect of an invisible blanket. David sighed with relief. His shoulders relaxed, and his complexion became less deathly pale. Professor McGonagall, he spoke again a minute later as they moved on. Yes. David, will I be expelled? There was genuine horror in his voice. We aren't allowed in the forest. And I followed that firefly. It was so beautiful, and I didn't notice I'd gone so far. And then it got dark, and that man. Minerva pursed her lips. A firefly. A classic lure. That wizard knew how to entice a child. It was not the boy's fault, but his misfortune. We shall discuss school rules later, in my office, over a cup of tea and biscuits, she replied sternly, but without malice. Right now, your only task is to lie quietly and gather your strength. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. They continued walking. Minerva felt her feline instincts beginning to reawaken. Her human vision was limited to the circle of light, but her hearing and smell, sharpened by years of being an animagus, scanned the darkness far beyond the limits of visibility. She heard a skulk of foxes scurrying somewhere to the left. Frightened by the magical explosion, she heard the heavy flight of an eagle owl somewhere in the pine tops. But it was not this that troubled her. She was troubled by what she did not hear. She did not hear the usual noise of small rodents and insects that typically filled the forest floor with life. The forest had frozen, holding its breath, and this meant that someone large was nearby. Someone whom even the mice feared. Suddenly, the fog trailing along the ground began to thicken. It rose in white waves, obscuring vision, muffling sounds. The light of the lumos began to reflect off microscopic water droplets, creating a blinding white wall around them. Minerva stopped. This was not just fog. It was a trap. She felt the moisture in the air turn sticky. The fog was trying to separate them. She could barely see the stretcher floating 2 paces away. David, she called. Silence. David. Minerva's voice became sharper. She took a step back, reaching out to where the stretcher should have been. But her fingers grasped only cold, damp air. The stretcher had vanished. Panic, cold and slippery, tried to seize her mind. But Minerva McGonagall was not one to succumb to panic. She was a teacher. She was responsible. She closed her eyes. Eyes in the fog lie. Other senses were needed. She recalled the sensation of cat whiskers. She imagined them growing on her face, catching the slightest fluctuations of the air. She did not transform fully, only allowed her animagus essence to surface, enhancing her human senses. To the left, a faint rustle of fabric. Behind, heavy breathing. Minerva spun around and pointed her wand into the fog. Ventus Duo. A powerful blast of wind erupted from her wand, tearing through the milky curtain. The fog spiraled and retreated, revealing the view. The stretcher with David was drifting slowly sideways into a thicket of blackthorn, but it was not moving on its own. It was being dragged. Thin, translucent vines hanging from the branches of old willows had entwined the legs of the stretcher and were pulling the boy towards the trunk of a tree. The willow was not the whomping one, but it was old and hungry, awakened by the dark energy of the ritual. David was asleep, lulled by charms or perhaps some soporific pollen released by the tree. Minerva did not attack with fire. Fire in the forest was the last resort. She chose another path. Transfiguration. She slashed her wand, describing a complex figure. Duro, she cried, aiming the spell at the earth near the willow's roots. The soft soil instantly turned to stone. The tree roots attempting to move found themselves encased in solid rock. The tree creaked, its branches, with the vines hanging limply, having lost their support and nourishment. Minerva ran to the stretcher and severed the vines with a Gryffindor charm. "Wake up, Gordon." She shook the boy lightly. David opened his eyes, blinking. "What? Have we arrived?" "No, we made a stop, but we must move faster." She realized the forest was not merely a passive observer. The residual dark magic had made it aggressive. Every bush, every tree could now become an enemy. She needed to forge a path that nature itself could not attack. She looked at the ground beneath her feet. Leaves, branches, moss. "Lapifors," she cried, pointing her wand at a large stone. The stone shuddered, sprouted ears, a tail, and paws. In an instant, a large stone hare sat before her. It was inanimate, yet mobile, a golem. "Pier totem locomotor," she whispered, animating it. "Run ahead. Distract." The stone hare bolted and bounded into the darkness, making a great deal of noise. Instantly, tree branches ahead lashed out in its direction, trying to snatch the prey. The forest reacted to the movement. "And now, us," said Minerva. She took control of the stretcher and, while the trees were busy fighting the invulnerable stone hare, quickly guided David along a safe path. It was a game of chess with nature itself. And Minerva McGonagall intended to win this match, piece by piece. But ahead, something worse than aggressive trees awaited them. They emerged at the edge of a deep ravine. The bridge that had once been here, an old fallen tree, had rotted and collapsed. Below, in the dark, water rushed. And on the opposite side of the ravine, on a cliff overhanging the abyss, sat three silhouettes. They looked like large dogs, but their eyes glowed red, and saliva dripped from their maws, steaming in the cold. Grimhounds, the hellhounds of the magical world. Not true demons, but magical beasts that sensed weakness and fear. And they were hungry. Minerva halted the stretcher. She knew, you cannot outrun a grimhound. They are faster than the wind. You cannot bargain with them. She looked at David, then at the abyss, and then at the hounds. A plan matured in her mind. A mad, dangerous, and only possible plan. She began to unfasten her cloak. "David, listen to me carefully," she said, not taking her eyes off the red eyes on the other bank. "I am going to do something strange. You must not be afraid. Whatever you see, do not scream and do not move. Do you understand?" Professor." The boy's voice trembled. "Trust me." Minerva threw off her heavy traveling cloak, remaining in her dress. She raised her wand, but not to attack. She pointed it at herself. "Geminio corporis," Minerva pronounced clearly. The tip of her wand touched her chest, and a silvery wave ran through the woman's body. She did not wait for the magic to dissipate. In the next instant, her human silhouette vanished, coiling into a tight spiral, and a tabby cat landed softly on the grass. But it was not a single cat. As soon as her paws touched the ground, the air around her shimmered like a heat haze over hot asphalt. To her left, an exact copy appeared. To her right, another. In a second, a whole pack sat on the edge of the ravine, a dozen absolutely identical striped predators with gleaming spectacle markings. The grimhounds on the other bank growled, confused. Their red eyes darted from one figure to another. They smelled only one living creature, but saw an entire army. The real Minerva let out a war cry, a piercing, wild yowl magnified by the echo of the ravine, and the entire pack burst into motion. They did not run back. They ran forward, straight into the abyss. It was a sight that took David's breath away. The cats leaped one after another, using debris of the old bridge, branches sticking out of the ravine walls, and even the backs of their doubles for support. It was a stream of striped fur flowing across the chasm, defying gravity. The grimhounds could not resist. The hunter's instinct overcame caution. They lunged forward, snapping their massive jaws, trying to intercept the prey in mid-air. The first hound jumped, aiming for the cat flying highest. Its fangs closed on her neck and passed straight through. The copy dissolved into silvery smoke, and the hound, losing momentum, whined pitifully and plummeted down into the dark water. The second hound proved smarter. It stayed on the cliff edge, waiting for the cats to land, but there were too many of them. They surrounded it, hissing and scratching. The real Minerva, taking advantage of the chaos, slipped between the monster's paws. She did not try to kill it. She was too small for that. She did what only cats can do. She became a liquid shadow tangling underfoot. The hound spun, trying to catch the insolent animal, got its legs tangled on the slippery moss, and losing its balance, fell into the abyss after its brethren. The third grimhound, seeing the fate of its companions, backed away. It growled, but the red fire in its eyes turned to fear. The cloning magic began to fade. The copies dissolved into the air, one by one, leaving only one real cat on the cliff. She stood at the very edge, back arched, tail fluffed to double its size, her fur sparking with residual magic. She looked larger and more terrifying than any hound. The grimhound gave a pitiful yelp, tucked its tail, and vanished into the darkness of the forest. Minerva exhaled. Transforming back into a human on this side of the ravine would have been safer, but she could not leave David. She refocused on her task. Remaining in cat form, she walked to the edge of the ravine and looked across. The stretcher with the boy still hung in the air, held by her spell which was beginning to weaken. She had to act fast. Minerva transformed back into a woman. "Accio stretcher," she cried, pointing her wand across the chasm. The stretcher surged forward, flew over the black water, and landed softly at her feet. David was pale as a sheet, but his eyes burned with awe. That was incredible. "Professor," he whispered, You multiplied them." Minerva smiled faintly. adjusting her spectacles which had slipped slightly during the transformation. The Geminio spell has many applications, Mr. Gordon, though I wouldn't recommend using it on living creatures without proper training. The sensation is quite ticklish. She looked him over. The boy was holding on, but the cold of the forest was taking its toll. We are nearly there. The worst is behind us. The last miles of the journey seemed endless. The forest, having lost its centuries and dark energy, became simply an old, dense forest. But now, every root seemed to try to catch Minerva's foot, and every branch tried to lash her face. She was tired. Tired in a way she hadn't been since the dueling days of her youth. Magical exhaustion manifested as a fine tremor in her hands and dark spots before her eyes. Maintaining the levitation of the stretcher, keeping Lumos lit, and staying vigilant was a heavy task, but she did not allow herself to stop. She knew, if she sat down now, she would not rise until morning. David dozed off, lulled by the rhythmic swaying of the stretcher. This was good. Fewer questions, less fear. Suddenly, the trees began to thin. The air became fresher, cooler, and carried the scent of the lake, the smell of water and silt, which had never seemed so pleasant to her. They stepped out onto the edge of the woods. Before them lay the sloping lawns of Hogwarts, bathed in silvery pre-dawn light. In the distance, on the hill, towered the castle. Its windows were dark, save for one, a window in the highest tower. Dumbledore was awake. He was waiting. But someone was waiting for them much closer. Right at the boundary of the forest, leaning on his gigantic crossbow, stood a familiar, mighty figure. Beside him sat Fang, Professor McGonagall. Hagrid's bass boomed as soon as he saw the light of her wand. The giant rushed to meet them, his heavy strides shaking the ground. Hagrid. Minerva allowed herself to exhale. Her shoulders slumped. The tension that had kept her going for the last few hours began to ebb, giving way to a wave of relief. Hagrid ran up to them, his beetle-black eyes full of anxiety. He looked at the stretcher, then at the exhausted professor. Merlin's beard. I heard noise, saw flashes, wanted to go in, but Dumbledore sent a Patronus, said to wait here. Is that young Gordon? Is he alive? He is alive. Hagrid. Exhausted, terrified, but whole. Minerva replied, stowing her wand. Take him. It will be easier for you to carry him than for my magic. Hagrid gently, with a tenderness only giants are capable of, scooped the boy up into his arms as if he were a feather. David didn't even wake, only muttered something in his sleep, nestling more comfortably into the giant's embrace. And how are ye? Professor. Hagrid looked at Minerva with concern. Her robes were torn at the hem. Her hair had escaped its tight bun, and a scratch reddened on her cheek. Yea, look. Like, yea, thought a dragon. Something worse. Hagrid. Solitude and darkness, she replied enigmatically, adjusting her pointed hat. Come. Poppy Pomfrey will not forgive us if the boy catches a final chill. They headed towards the castle. Now that Hagrid was carrying David, Minerva could walk freely. She walked slightly behind, enjoying the simple sensation of firm ground beneath her feet, devoid of squelching bog. She looked up. The sky in the east was beginning to lighten, acquiring a soft pink hue. The night was retreating. Stars faded one by one, dissolving into the morning light. She looked at her hands. They were dirty, with traces of soot and earth. But these were hands that had saved a life tonight. She recalled the sensation of cat paws, the softness of moss, the scent of danger. Tonight she had been more beast than human, and it had given her a strength not taught in books. When they approached the main gates of the castle, Minerva stopped for a moment and looked back at the forest. It stood as a dark wall, still mysterious and dangerous. But now it was silent. There was no ominous hum. It was the ordinary silence of nature, awaiting the sunrise. Mischief managed, she whispered to herself, a phrase she had often heard from a certain quartet of insufferable Gryffindors. Although in her case, it was not mischief, but a victory. She turned and walked into the open gates, where warmth, light, and a new day awaited them. The vast oak doors of the Hogwarts entrance hall closed behind them, with a deep, booming sound that echoed beneath the high stone vaults. This sound, which on ordinary days seemed stern and official, rang out for Minerva today, like the sweetest melody. It was a sound of finality. It cut off the cold, hostile chaos of the night forest from the warm, ordered world of the school. Inside the castle, silence reigned, that special, deep silence of the pre-dawn hour, when even the most active ghosts tire of wandering the corridors and hide in their secret niches. Only the wind keened faintly, somewhere high in the chimneys, a reminder of the inclement weather outside. But here, behind thick walls, protected by millennial charms, it was powerless. The light of the torches burning along the walls was soft and golden. It danced on the suits of armor, turning their metal figures into silent sentinels of peace. This way, careful now," whispered Hagrid, trying to tread as quietly as possible, though his gigantic boots still produced a dull thud on the stone floor. He carried David Gordon to the hospital wing so carefully, as if holding a fragile dragon egg. Minerva walked alongside, barely lifting her feet. Now that the danger had passed, the adrenaline that had kept her body taut for the last few hours began to drain away rapidly, leaving behind a leaden fatigue. Every muscle, every bone ached with a dull pain, a reminder of wild leaps, impacts against stone, and magical exhaustion. When they entered the hospital wing, Madame Pomfrey was already waiting for them. Dumbledore had evidently warned her via a portrait messenger. She stood in the middle of the ward in her dressing gown and nightcap, resolute and focused, wand at the ready. Oh, the poor boy. She clasped her hands the moment she saw David's pale face. Put him here. Hagrid. On this bed. Quickly. The air in the hospital wing smelled of antiseptic potions, dried lavender, and chocolate, scents that at Hogwarts were always associated with recovery. Hagrid gently lowered the boy onto the starched white sheets. Pomfrey instantly began to cast, her wand describing complex pirouettes over the patient's body, scanning his vital signs. Severe magical exhaustion. Hypothermia. Shock, she muttered. And multicolored bottles of medicine flew to her from the shelves of their own accord. But vital organs are untouched. He is young. His magic will recover quickly. He needs sleep and plenty of strengthening solution. Minerva stood aside, leaning on the back of a chair. She watched as Poppy poured a pearlescent liquid into the mouth of the half-asleep boy. David sighed, his cheeks pinked slightly, and he sank into a deep, healing sleep without dreams. And now you, Minerva. The nurse turned sternly to her. Sit down. You look as if the whomping willow chewed you up and spat you back out. I am fine. Poppy. Minerva tried to object, though her voice sounded raspy. Just scratches. Do not argue with me in my own wing, snapped Pomfrey, already approaching her with a jar of bright orange ointment. You have a mark of dark magic on your cheek, and your hands are shaking so much you couldn't hold a teacup. Minerva submitted. She allowed her wounds to be treated. The ointment was cool and instantly relieved the pain. Then Poppy made her drink a pepper-up potion, which caused steam to pour from her ears. But her head cleared immediately, and a pleasant warmth spread through her body. Thank you, Minerva said sincerely, standing up. But I shall go to my quarters. I need my armchair and silence. Just promise you will go to sleep immediately, Pomfrey admonished her. And no marking homework. Bidding farewell to Hagrid, who remained to keep watch by David's bed. He refused to leave until the boy woke up. Minerva walked out into the corridor. The way to Gryffindor Tower seemed long, but pleasant. The castle was waking up. Somewhere below, in the kitchens, house elves were already starting to prepare breakfast. A faint aroma of fresh baking began to seep through the flagstones. Portraits on the walls began to stretch in their frames, greeting her with sleepy nods. Reaching the portrait of the fat lady, Minerva stopped. Password? Asked the lady in the pink dress sleepily, barely opening her eyes. Fortitudo, Minerva pronounced quietly. The portrait swung forward, revealing the passage. But Minerva did not go into the students' common room. She turned into a side corridor leading to her private quarters. She opened the door and exhaled. She was home. The room welcomed her with a coziness created over years. Walls hung with tapestries of Scottish landscapes, shelves crammed with leather-bound books, an old desk cluttered with parchment. In the fireplace, which she had left cold, a fire crackled merrily to life, the room's magic reacting to her arrival. Warm, golden light flooded the space, banishing the remnants of night shadows. Minerva walked to the window. From her tower, a view of the eastern grounds opened up. The sky was no longer black. It had turned deep blue, and on the horizon, above the treetops of the Forbidden Forest, a thin strip of pale gold appeared. Dawn was approaching. She looked at the forest. From here, from height and safety, it looked simply like a large mass of trees. It was hard to believe that an hour ago she had been fighting for her life there. But she knew, the forest remembers. And she would remember. There was a quiet knock at the door. It was not the knock of a student or a colleague. It was a delicate, polite knock she would recognize anywhere. Come in, Albus, she said, not turning around. The door opened without a creak, and Albus Dumbledore entered the room. He wore a long woolen dressing gown of plum color, embroidered with silver crescent moons, and on his feet were soft slippers with curled toes. His appearance was so domestic, and far from the image of a mighty wizard, that Minerva felt the corners of her mouth twitch in a slight smile. He held a small silver tray on which steamed 2 porcelain cups and a pot-bellied teapot painted with cornflowers. The aroma of bergamot and lemon balm instantly filled the room, mingling with the smell of book dust and the logs smoldering in the fireplace. I thought you might care for some company, the headmaster said softly, placing the tray on a small table by the armchair. And, naturally, some proper tea. What they serve in the hospital wing is undoubtedly beneficial, but you must agree, it tastes like a goblin's old sock steeped in hot water." Minerva laughed quietly. This laugh removed the last tension from her shoulders. "You are, as always, perceptive, Albus. Thank you." She finally moved away from the window and sank into her deep armchair. Her body responded gratefully to the softness of the cushions. Dumbledore sat opposite, in the guest chair, and with a wave of his hand, caused the teapot to pour the amber liquid into the cups. Neither spoon nor sugar bowl clinked. The headmaster's magic was as soft and noiseless as his footsteps. They sat in silence for a few minutes, simply enjoying the warmth of the drink. Outside the window, the sky brightened, transitioning from dark blue to soft lilac. It was that time of day when the world hangs on the border between dream and reality. He was strong. Albus. Minerva broke the silence, staring into the fire. That wizard. He was no amateur who read a couple of forbidden books. He knew the old rituals. He knew how to wake the forest. Dumbledore nodded slowly, his face becoming serious, though his eyes remained calm. "Darkness has many forms, Minerva, and sadly, it has a knack for finding a way even to forgotten places. What you saw was an echo of ancient times, when magic was wild and uncontrolled. The druids who built that circle were not evil, but their power was elemental, and evil loves to use the elements for its own ends." He took a sip of tea and looked at her over his half-moon spectacles. But he failed to account for one thing. "What exactly?" she asked. "That the forest would accept you." Minerva raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Accept me? It tried to kill me, Albus. Trees. Roots. Even the water. Everything was against us." "Dark magic tried to kill you," Dumbledore corrected her. "It twisted the forest, forced it to defend itself. But you entered not as a conqueror, not as a wizard dictating their will with a wand. You entered as part of nature, as a beast. And that is precisely what saved Mr. Gordon." Minerva pondered this. She recalled the moment at the edge of the abyss when instinct suggested the right decision. She recalled feeling the vibration of the earth through her paws. Being a cat. "It is strange," she admitted quietly. "The world becomes simpler. There are no politics, no fear of the future, no complex moral choices. There is only here and now. There is the scent of the enemy, the warmth of a friend, the path home. Sometimes I fear that one day I will want to remain there." In that simplicity, Dumbledore smiled, and wrinkles of wisdom gathered at the corners of his eyes. "That is why you are the finest Transfiguration teacher this castle has known. You understand the essence of change, but you always return, because your heart is the heart of a human, Minerva, a heart that aches for others. A cat may save herself, but only a human is capable of risking their life for another's child." These words warmed her more than the tea. She felt gratitude fill her chest. "What will become of the boy?" she asked. "He saw a lot. Too much for a first year. Poppy will tend to his body, and time to his memory," the headmaster replied. "We shall not wipe his memory, if that is what you mean. Fear is a lesson. He will remember that magic is not a toy, but he will also remember that in the darkest forest there is always someone who will come to help. That knowledge is more important than any spell." Dumbledore finished his tea and placed the cup on the tray. He stood up, his robes rustling softly. "And now, my dear Professor, you need rest, real rest. Tomorrow, or rather, today, is Saturday. I shall take the liberty of cancelling your morning tutorials. Sleep as much as your feline soul desires." He walked to the door, but stopped on the threshold and turned. "And? Minerva? Yes. Albus? Next time you decide to take a stroll down a moonlit path, do call me. I, of course, cannot transform into a graceful predator, but I am told I am quite good at creating diversions." He winked, and the door closed behind him. Minerva was left alone. The conversation with Albus had brought her the peace she so lacked. She felt the last remnants of anxiety leaving the room, flying up the chimney, along with the sparks from the logs. She looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was nearly 5 in the morning. The sun had already touched the mountain peaks, painting the world in pink and gold. She felt her eyelids growing heavy. The human body demanded sleep, but before getting into bed, she wanted one more moment. A moment of absolute harmony. She stood and walked to the window, opening it wide. The morning air, fresh and clean, rushed into the room, bringing with it the scent of dew and damp earth. She inhaled it deeply. It was the scent of life. The forest had awakened. She heard the distant singing of birds, which was growing louder, greeting the new day. Darkness had lost. The light had returned. Minerva closed the window, drew the heavy velvet curtains, leaving the room in a pleasant twilight, illuminated only by the flickering fireplace. She walked to her 4-poster bed. When she lay down, wrapping herself in the quilt, she felt her inner beast settling down to sleep as well. The cat inside her curled into a ball somewhere deep in her subconscious, satisfied and sated with victory. But just as sleep was about to overcome her, Minerva remembered one small detail. She smiled into her pillow. She remembered the look of the Grimhound when it saw a dozen cats. "Mischief managed," she whispered, already half asleep. And Hogwarts slept with her, guarding the dreams of its defenders.